to investigate the crime scene afterward. How long was it, as you said, before the FBI was allowed access into Benghazi to examine that crime scene?
17 days.
17 days. Was the crime scene secured during that time?
No, it was not. We repeatedly asked the government of Libya to secure the crime scene and prevent interlopers, but they were unable to do so.
So let me get the timeline finalized here. So the FBI is sitting in Tripoli for weeks, waiting for the approval of the Libyan government to travel to Benghazi. Is that appropriate?
Well, they were attempting to do their job from Tripoli as best they could.
But they were denied access into Benghazi, right?
Correct.
So what were they doing with their time?
They were interviewing witnesses that they could find in Tripoli and could meet with in Tripoli, and they were also engaging with the government in order to develop a cooperative investigation with the Libyans who had sent an investigator to Benghazi.
Were you interviewed by the FBI?
No, I was never interviewed by the FBI.
Never. Nice story. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. And, you know, it's my understanding that we've had 9 oversight hearings on Benghazi since the horrific attacks on our consulate on September 11, 2012. And like many of my colleagues have expressed to the family, I believe that we need to continue to do everything within our power as Congress to get to the solutions and the recommendations that will prevent this from happening again. And I think that in addition to our condolences, the things that we need to do most is our job, to come up with the recommendations to prevent this. One of the overall conclusions of the Accountability Review Board was just that, quote, that Congress must do its part to meet this challenge and provide necessary resources to the State Department to address security risks and meet mission imperatives. That was a direct statement out of the Review Board recommendation. And I think each of you agree that Congress must do its part. Am I correct? Yes or no, real quick.
Yes.
So, you know, Mr. Chairman, I just would hope that after this hearing, after 9 oversight hearings, that we will begin to work on some specific recommendations that we can bring forward, and that all of us working together can do our job to protect our embassies. I think that's what the public wants. I believe and hope that that's what the families want in the memory and the legacy of those who lost their lives. And I would say that it does cost money. Mr. Nordstrom, I know you say it's not just about money, but it also is about properly prioritizing budget considerations. And, you know, in the past, you know, my colleagues on the other side have not been willing to make the kinds of serious and sustained commitments to funding that are necessary for large-scale and long-term security projects like building facility improvements, for example.
Would the gentleman yield briefly?
May I?
Of course.
Thank you. And so in both the 2011 and 2012 budget cycles, the budgets gave the State Department hundreds of millions of dollars less than what was requested. The fiscal year 2013 budget as proposed by the other side proposed even more cuts. They want to reduce international affairs budget by more than $5 billion less than it was in fiscal year 12. That is a 9.8% cut to diplomatic security when extrapolated across the whole foreign affairs budget. By the fiscal year 2016, the proposed budget by the other side further cuts funding to international affairs by another $5 billion. This represents a 20% cut to diplomatic security when extrapolated over the entire foreign affairs budget. So these are serious and significant cuts, and we cannot pretend that they don't have consequences. And so I know that my colleagues have talked several times about holding people accountable. Well, I hope that one of those groups that we will hold accountable are ourselves, as members of Congress, to do our job to properly fund the safety of our embassies so that this never happens again. I urge my Republican counterparts to work with us in a bipartisan effort to actually fund these improvements to our embassy security and to follow through on the 29 ARB recommendations that have already been made and those that we believe should also be supported from this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We now go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I note for the record that Charlene Lamb, who testified before this committee the previous time, was asked specifically the question as to whether or not funding issues impacted the actions that took place, and she said no. So, and I'm really intrigued at this point in time by some of the commentary, because one of the things I'd like to follow up on the questioning, Mr. Nordstrom, that came to you from Mr. Langford with regards to some of the decisions that were made, because being in Benghazi, having the Secretary, because I'm going to tell you, I am struggling to find out how we had a United States ambassador in a marginally safe American compound in an increasingly hostile area on an iconic day like September 11th with limited security. And I think that there are some issues that you were talking about first. Decisions that were made about allowing occupancy in the first place. Could you tell me quickly about how that was enabled to be approved?
That's the same question I still have to this day.
You do not know, but you do know, according to the law, it appears that it must be signed off by the Secretary of State, and there is no delegation.
Certainly for parts of it, yes, for the SECA portion of it. Following up,
on July 31st, it's a fact that where I go back on the record, there were 16 SSTs, actually Special Forces in Libya, 14 Department of State security personnel. On August 31st, just shortly before, that had been reduced to 6 regulation individuals in Tripoli, 3 in Benghazi. Why the cutback on security?
Again, that's one of the questions that I had. I've never seen it addressed in the ARB or anything else, is why were these decisions that we made turned down? Why were, in fact, there was a proposal that went back all the way to a month after we had arrived, asking for $2.1 million for staffing to have 19 DS agents maintained throughout that time period. I still don't have any understanding as what happened to that proposal. That went to the Undersecretary of Management as part of the
Did you have confidence in the ability of the locals in the country who were purportedly designed to provide security for you? Did you have confidence in their ability to provide that?
I think, to put it succinctly, it was the best bad plan. It was the only thing we had.
It was the only thing, but I didn't ask if it wasn't. Did you have confidence in that?
No.
Did you report that at any point in time to officials in Washington, D.C.?
We did. We did note the training deficiencies in particular. That was something that was always there. Certainly, we had also raised the issue of doing some sort of counterintelligence vetting of the people that worked for us. Ultimately, that was turned down, even though we wanted it, because the Department of State wanted Post to pay the funds for it, which we didn't have. It had always been under our understanding that that was going to be paid for by Washington.
Thank you. So, Mr. Thompson, I know that you have background in counterterrorism. I'm going back on, this is testimony that was provided by Lieutenant Colonel Wood, who was an SST person doing service in Tripoli and ultimately wanted to be in Benghazi. He talked about Facebook threats that were made about Western influences in Benghazi. I also note then a series of issues: an RPG attack on the Red Cross in early May, a Red Cross second attack in June, an IED attack against the UN mission in April 6, an IED attack against a UN convoy on April 10th, an assassination attempt on the British ambassador in June 11th with RPGs, an attempted carjacking on August 6th of 2 SST officers of the United States. In your mind, does this, in your professional opinion, would this suggest to you that the facility in Benghazi, by a reasonable person with your experience or a reasonable person in the State Department, would be likely to be considered a possible or even likely target of a terrorist incident?
It certainly had all the indicators of that based on that history, yes, Congressman.
And in light of that, and in light of your experience at Mr. Nordstrom's testimony, would you have been happy with the idea that it was allowed to be maintained under less than the staffing that had existed only a month before or 2 months before, and under standards which were only 2 in the entire country, according to the testimony of Mr. Nordstrom, that were not meeting the requirements, the minimal requirements of safety?
No, sir. It doesn't make
Mr. Nordstrom or Mr. Hicks, what is normalization and why were we doing this?
That's been a question even that the ARB raised and others have raised. I'm not sure. I mean, sarcastically, we saw it as do more with less, but that I first saw that term normalization in that budget proposal, a resource proposal, a month after we had arrived. There was already talk about normalizing our footprint. It was then picked up again in February when Greg's predecessor had met with Das Lamb. Same thing. It struck me as being part of some sort of script, just like the reason why he didn't close the facility in Benghazi despite the risks. There was already a political decision that said we're going to keep that open. That's fine, but no one's ever come out and said that we made that risk and we made that decision and take responsibility for it.
I thank the gentleman.
My time's expired, but Mr. Hicks, did you have a response to that as well?
Normalization to us was moving towards being like a normal embassy instead of having being, in a sense, under siege or in a hostile environment where we're surrounded by potential threats. And we wanted to move towards normal life, and it also meant removing or a withdrawal of extra DS personnel and then a movement towards our diplomatic security personnel managing more of a program that included the recruitment of Libyans to provide additional the security that we needed.
Thank you. Mr. Hicks, you mentioned earlier your wife being such an important part of your decision process. Were you planning on bringing her to Libya since it was normalized?
Just, Mr. Chairman, thanks. Just to correct, I was actually selected to be DCM by Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, Jeff Feltman, in Tripoli.
Jeff and I spent a lot of time in the 2006 war in Lebanon together.
Yeah.
He's a good man.
Yeah.
But as to family returning to Libya, I mean, normalization means you bring back dependents and so on. Was that part of what was going on?
That's what we were pointing towards, in fact. And Chris and I had a long talk on the night of September 9th before we left for Benghazi, and we talked about this, that we felt optimistic about the trajectory. That even though all of these security problems were going on, we felt that the Libyans were getting their political act together. They were going to pull together a government. They were going to get a constitution. Their economy was going to pick up. They were going to stabilize. And my next project was, in fact, to reach out to the board members of the American School and start working with them about the possibility of opening the school in September. And that would, of course, allowed me to bring my family to join me in Tripoli. And that was actually a condition that my wife made for my going to my second unaccompanied assignment. So
I'm sure she's glad to have you home now, though.
yes, she's very glad to have me home.
With that, we go to the gentleman from New Mexico who's been patiently waiting. Oh, I'm sorry. Who's next? Mr. Cardenas, next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. my condolences to all the families and everybody who suffered from this tragedy. And also, I hope that you pray for us that we do the right thing as policymakers and not as politicians. Mr. Nordstrom, you've stated here that you felt the security situation in Benghazi was unsafe. As a matter of fact, you've been very clear on placing blame with a number of people. So given everything that was going on at the time and everything you have said today and what you said on October 10th, at any point did you suggest to Ambassador Stevens that he should not travel to Benghazi on September 11th's anniversary, and that the situation was volatile and that the facility, per your own assessment, was not secure?
I had departed post on 26th of July, so I didn't have the opportunity to do that. I would defer that to the RSO that was there at the time, John Martinek. It's my understanding that he also had raised some concerns and discussed that.
So you have your opinions today, but you did not have those same opinions back then?
I wasn't at post
Okay.
for September 11th. I had departed 6 weeks prior. So,
If the gentleman would indulge, I think he's asking, what was your opinion on the day you left relative to Benghazi?
Oh, okay, I understand. I had actually met with the ambassador prior to that as part of an out briefing, and he and I talked about kind of the way forward, and the threats in the East were something that we talked about. I had mentioned that in October as well. It was very concerning to us, the increase in the targeting. It was something that I had mentioned back to our headquarters in reporting. It was something that the Ministry of Interior brought up when the ambassador went and met with the minister in July to talk about requesting static security. They highlighted, number one, growing extremism in the East, particularly in Benghazi, in Derna, and Sirte. So absolutely, that was something that we discussed, and we were concerned in particular that we were not getting the resources.
So you stressed that you did stress concerns, but not to the point where you said, I wouldn't go if I were you, or
we never had that discussion, in part because the ambassador had not indicated any sort of desire to travel to Benghazi. My hope would have been that they would have had resources there to augment any such travel.
Okay. And resources require other kinds of resources. I mean, if you have resources on the ground, they require actual funding, et cetera. There's a balance to creating the kind of atmosphere and security that would be required to meet any concerns, correct?
Sure. In what we were looking at is that you were going to have a downsizing of personnel in Tripoli. So anytime the ambassador would have traveled, that would have impacted security in both locations because you would have been splitting up resources, which is what I think ultimately happened.
Mr. Hicks, can you shed some light on this discussion that we're having?
In the two planning meetings that we had for Ambassador Stevens' trip to Benghazi, Regional Security Officer John Martinek raised serious concerns about his travel. Because of those concerns, the ambassador adjusted his plans for that trip. First, he agreed that he would go in a low-profile way. His trip would not be announced in advance. We would not do any planning of meetings until right before he went. Second, he eventually decided also to shorten his trip. He initially had planned to go on the 8th. He went on the 10th instead to narrow the time frame that he would be in Tripoli. The third step that he took was that one public event that he planned would take place at the very end of his trip, just before he left.
Okay. So basically, you're describing what I feel to be consistent. What I've known of the ambassador is that he was very, very committed. He did listen to advice, et cetera, but he was very determined, and he continued to do his job.
Exactly. He went there to do his job. He felt that he had a political imperative to go to Benghazi and represent the United States there in order to move the project forward to make the Benghazi Consulate a permanent constituent post.
Okay. I I'm so proud of his commitment, and that is very consistent with everybody who's come across him. I just hope that we can have that commitment up here as elected officials to do the right thing so this never happens again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is about one thing, one simple thing. It's finding the truth. And I know these families here want the truth, and I know the American people want the truth. But yet, I listened to this questioning today, and there seems to be a real partisan feel to finding the truth, and I don't understand that. I mean, if you listen to the other side, you'd think it's time just to move on from this. They would agree with Secretary Clinton, right, that they would just say, what difference does it make? Well, some of the family members I talked to before this hearing, I guarantee this hearing makes a difference today. We want to know who made some of these decisions and why they made some of these decisions. The only encouraging part that I heard from the other side is that they feel that you all should be protected. Your ability to testify here and your desire to testify here should be protected, so that's good. And I want you to know I really appreciate you all being here. It does matter. It matters to a lot of people. Mr. Hicks, after your visit with Congressman Chaffetz, or Congressman Chaffetz's visit, did you feel any kind of shift in the way you were treated?
Yes, again, I did. When Assistant Secretary Jones visited shortly after, prior to the visit, Assistant Secretary Jones had visited, and she pulled me aside and again said I needed to improve my management style and indicated that people were upset. I had no indication that my staff was upset at all, other than with the conditions that we were facing. Following my return to the United States, I attended Chris's funeral in San Francisco, and then I came back to Washington. Assistant Secretary Jones summoned me to her office, and she delivered a blistering critique of my management style. And she even said, I exclaimed, "I don't know why Larry Pope would want you to come back." And she said she didn't even understand why anyone at Tripoli would want me to come back.
But yet, right after the attack and before the attack, you had all kinds of praise for your leadership. You got a call from Secretary Clinton. You got a call from the President praising you for your service and how you handled things. Was there a seminal moment in your mind to when all this praise and appreciation turned into something else?
In hindsight, I think it began after I asked the question about Ambassador Rice's statement on the TV shows.
Mm-hmm. And anyone listening to this hearing today, if they don't have questions, I mean, there was some comment made about, well, there was a few people in Libya that had a problem with this YouTube video, but the overwhelming evidence is that this was a terrorist attack. Everybody knew it, but yet someone higher up decided to run with this story, this facade, and they kept it for a long time. And I would think that everyone sitting here wants to know the answer why that was done. So what other impediments have you had, or how have you felt since deciding to come forward? Do you feel like they've treated you any differently from that point on?
Well, after I was angry with the way I'd been criticized, I thought it was unfounded. I felt like I'd been tried and convicted in absentia, but I decided I was going to go back and try to redeem myself in Tripoli.
What is your job right now?
What is my job? I am a Foreign Affairs Officer in the Office of Global Intergovernmental Affairs.
Okay, a far cry from where you were and your level of capabilities.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So when you came back to the United States, were you planning on going back to Libya?
I was. I fully intended to do so.
And what do you think happened?
Based on the criticism that I received, I felt that if I went back, I would never be comfortable working there. Mm-hmm. And in addition, my family really didn't want me to go back. We'd endured a year of separation when I was in Afghanistan in 2006 and 2007, and that was the overriding factor. So I voluntarily curtailed. I accepted an offer of what's called a no-fault curtailment. That means that there would be no criticism of my departure of post, no negative repercussions. And in fact, Ambassador Pope, when he made the offer to everyone in Tripoli when he arrived, Chargé Pope, when he arrived, he indicated that people could expect that they would get a good onward assignment out of that.
All right. Well, thank you. I would just close with the fact that, we have a president that's made it his policy since he took office not to knee-jerk or jump to conclusions when it comes to some tragedy or event. But yet, why did he do it in this case? Why was he quick to jump to the conclusion that this was a protest due to a YouTube video? I think we all know that's not true, and I think we all need to find the answer to that.
Thank you. And of course.
Could I just clarify? The job that I have right now, between my curtailment and my finding of this job that I have now, I had no meaningful employment. I was in a status called Near Eastern Affairs over complement, and the job now is a significant, it's a demotion. Foreign Affairs Officer is a designation that is given to our civil service colleagues who are desk officers. So I've been effectively demoted from Deputy Chief of Mission to desk officer.
Let me just interject one thing at this time. In your opening statement, I note, and it's already in the record, but I want to make sure that it's separately placed in at this moment, you included an unclassified document purported to be from the President of the United States to the President of Libya. Is that correct?
Yes.
I want to be very careful. It doesn't have a signature. It looks like it was electronically transmitted.
It's a cable.
This cable, was it, as far as you know, from the President of the United States directly?
Yes.
And was it delivered to the President of Libya directly?
It was.
And does it mention terrorist attack anywhere else? And I'd note that this is September 17th, which would be that Monday afterwards. Does this, in your opinion, in any way, shape, or form, describe the unfortunate circumstances as terrorism to the President of Libya?
I believe it does.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I don't even know.
It's in his opening statement. It was delivered to everybody.
Okay.
These are inclusions. But it says, thank you for responding quickly to the tragic attack in Benghazi. And I'm reading through this thing, it's in the record, but as far as I can tell, it speaks of it as a tragic attack. It doesn't speak to it even after Ambassador Rice spoke. It doesn't speak to it as a terrorist attack or our war on terror or fighting terrorism. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't have it before me at this moment.
Okay, we'll deliver it back to you just to make sure someone may want to follow up, and your counsel has it for you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it says outrageous attack.
Okay, so it's an outrageous attack, but it doesn't talk about us working together to fight terrorism, does it?
No.
Okay, thank you for including that in the record. We now go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farrell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to also join my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in expressing our condolences to the families of Ambassador Stevens, Sean Smith, Tyrone Wood, and Glenn Doherty, and all of those others injured. I want to quickly clear up just a couple of loose ends from earlier testimony, and then I want to ask a couple of questions about the February 17th Martyr Brigade. But first off, Mr. Hicks, you've testified on numerous occasions that you never got a chance to read the classified ARB report. You do have security clearance that you sat in with the meeting with Mr. Chaffetz that your minder couldn't attend, so you do have security clearance.
Yes, sir.
All right. And then, Mr. Thompson, you testified and answered the question as to why the FEST team, your response team, was not deployed. One of the things you heard was it might not be to a safe location. Do you guys train to deploy to Canada or the Caribbean islands or other safe locations, or are you trained to respond to hotspots?
Hotspots.
And would there have been any reluctance on the part of you or any of the men or women in your organization to go to Libya or anywhere in the world that you were needed to protect Americans?
I hang out with a very noble and brave crowd. The answer is no.
I didn't think so. And then, Mr. Hicks, I want to talk a little bit about what was going on in Libya at the time. There had just been a revolution. We had a newly elected president, democratically elected. We were involved through our NATO partners in that. This was probably a win for the United States. We had a friendly government relatively friendly government going in, and then we all but make the new president out to, we throw him under the bus on the Sunday shows. And you testified that that may have been one of the reasons the FBI was slow getting in. Do you think it overall damaged our relationship beyond that with Libya?
It complicated things for that period of time, I think, particularly with respect to the FBI mission. But the Libyan people, as a poll released by Gallup right before 9/11 attests, valued our relationship highly. In fact, higher than almost any other Arab country. It was over 50% of the population.
And isn't that one of the reasons Ambassador Stevens went to Benghazi on that fateful day, is to continue to show our support for what was going on in Libya at the time?
Absolutely, especially to the people of Benghazi.
All right, now I want to go on. There have been some reports floating around. Can you, Mr. Nordstrom, can you tell me what the role of the February 17th Martyrs Brigade was in protecting the consulate in Benghazi?
Certainly. That was the unit, for lack of a better term, that was provided to us by the Libyan government.
Now, were you aware of any ties of that militia to Islamic extremists?
Absolutely. Yeah, we had that discussion on a number of occasions, the last of which was when there was a Facebook posting of a threat that named Ambassador Stevens and Senator McCain, who was coming out for the elections. That was in the July timeframe. I had met with some of my agents and then also with some annex personnel. We discussed that.
And Mr. Hicks, you were in Libya on the night of the attack. Do you believe the February 17th militia played a role in those attacks, was complacent in those attacks?
Certainly elements of that militia were complicit in the attacks. The attackers had to make a long approach march through multiple checkpoints that were manned by February 17 militia.
All right, now, okay, I'm going to, Mr. Hicks and Mr. Nordstrom, I'm going to ask you both this question. I mean, I'm stunned that the State Department was relying on a militia with extremist ties to protect American diplomats. That doesn't make any sense. How does that happen?
You mean like in Afghanistan, where Afghanis that are working with our military that are embedded and turn on them and shoot them, or Yemen, our embassy was attacked in 2008 by attackers wearing police uniforms, or in Saudi Arabia, in Jeddah, we had an attack in 2004. The Saudi National Guard that was protecting our facility reportedly ran from the scene, and then it took 90 minutes before we could get help.
Pretty high unemployment in the United States. I would imagine there's some people that would be willing to take it, Americans that would be willing to take jobs overseas.
We couldn't agree with you more, but unfortunately, as I said earlier, one of the things that we ran into, that was the best bad plan. That was the unit that the Libyan government had initially designated for VIP protection.
Well,
it was very difficult to extract ourselves from that.
I certainly hope that these hearings will result in us not having to rely on the best of bad plans, and we can use folks like Mr. Thompson and his group for what they were intended and secure our personnel. I see I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Only by a little. We now go to the distinguished gentleman from the great state of Washington, the chairman of the Resources Committee, Mr. Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me add my voice to all of my colleagues that thank you for your service. I think while we all say it, it probably should go without saying it, but nevertheless, we really do appreciate that. Mr. Hicks, I want to follow up. You may have answered this, so I just want to get a clarification, because Mr. Jordan was entering into questions regarding the lawyer that came in and was not allowed to go to the meeting because wasn't qualified to go to that meeting. My question specifically is to back up. The State Department sent this lawyer. Were you told why the lawyer was sent?
He was sent to participate in all the meetings and all events associated with Congressman Chaffetz's visit.
Okay. Did you find that unusual?
I never had occurred before in my career.
Okay, but they did. The State Department did say that this lawyer was going to come and participate in all of the meetings.
Yes.
You were told that, and then of course they couldn't because of the protocols. You mentioned that the tone of the State Department as related to you changed probably after the Rice interview.
It began to change.
Yeah. Explain, just give us some examples of how things changed.
Again, I began to have my management style counseled by Assistant Secretary Jones. When she visited, she again counseled me on my management style and said staff was upset. I had had no indication of staff being upset. And then again, when I returned to Washington, she delivered a very blistering critique of my style and again exclaimed, "I don't know why Larry Pope would want you back."
Well, that leads to a very obvious question then. Prior to September 10th, 2012, had you received any negative feedback from your superiors?
No. Chris and I had developed a very positive relationship. He trusted me, I trusted him, and we were working together very, very well, and the morale was high.
Well, I suppose in a career as long as yours, you might have some disagreement with your superiors. Was it to the extent that you have felt that you were treated after this event last September compared to prior maybe disagreements you may have with your superiors? I guess on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst,
10.
And you were
10
after. Okay, all right. I guess that's what I would like to wanted to follow up on. You mentioned that you feel in the job you have, it's really a demotion from the qualifications that you have had in your career in the service. Have you talked to any of your colleagues or any senior leaders within the State Department regarding this, and if so, what was those conversations all about?
I spoke with, after a couple of friends who have outside the department intervened with senior officials about my situation, the Deputy Secretary Burns and the Director General said that I would be taken care of. Same thing that Larry Pope had indicated. And so I met with the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Resources, Hans Clem, and I talked to him about what options might be available to me. And basically the answer was I would have to go through the formal, normal bidding process for assignments and persuade someone that I should be hired. And then the conversation with Deputy Secretary Burns was centered around discussions I'd had with the leadership of our embassy in Mexico City about the head of the political section job there, which would be a very good job. And he said that he would support that, but I had to go through the process, and it's a very long process since that position is at a higher grade.
Well, let me ask you this. Going through the process, and I understand there's protocols, but would that strike you as unusual as somebody with your background and the position that you had in Libya and other areas?
I was surprised that I was having to go through the process, the normal process.
Okay.
And especially when the ambassador in Mexico City had talked to Deputy Secretary Burns about bringing me on as his political counselor.
Well, I heard my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say that if there's any retribution, that's my words, not your words, any retribution on this, that you will have full support of your colleagues. Let me lend my support, and I think support of everybody here. I think a bipartisan support on somebody that comes forth that has a difference of agreement on a policy issue or a decision that killed 4 Americans deserve to have whatever we can give to you. So thank you very much, and I see my time has expired.
Well, and the time that we can ask witnesses to stay seated without a break has also expired. So for those of us who are able to get up and come back and forth, we're going to take about 10 minutes. I would ask the witnesses, you can either go through that door or this door to use facilities that are available there without going out into the public, and then we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Darrell Issa, the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, is saying that the committee taking about a 10-minute break. They've been at it for just over 4 hours, a hearing on the attacks on the U.S. Consulate in Benghazi, Libya on September 11th, 2012. We're going to stay here live and open up our phone lines to hear from you about what you've seen over the past 4 hours or so. The numbers to use to call in are for Democrats, 202-585-3885. For Republicans, 202-585-3886. For independents and others, that's 202-585-3887. We will also check our Facebook page. We posted a question earlier today about your thoughts on the Benghazi investigation, and in particular what you're hearing today from the three witnesses, Gregory Hicks, Eric Nordstrom, and Mark Thompson. So that's facebook.com/cspan. For those of you on Twitter, our hashtag today is Benghazi. Lots of tweets. We'll get to a couple of them, as we will get to your phone calls as well. Again, it should be about 10-15 minutes for this break in the House Oversight Committee. Just a couple other notes, too. Of the 5 or more hours we expect of hearings today, we're going to play back the highlights, some of the highlights this evening on C-SPAN, beginning at about 9 o'clock Eastern. And we'll also have that for you at Sunday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern, highlights from today's hearing. Again, it's gone 4 hours already. The word from the committee is it could go several hours more. So lots to see, lots to talk about. Rich is in White Plains, New York, on our Republican line. Hi, Rich.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing fine, thanks.
I think it's pretty obvious that there's a cover-up by the testimony given today in Congress. People who were there are saying that there was absolutely no protest, that this was an attack, there was no demonstration, and the administration has to explain themselves as to how they came about with the false narrative put forward by Susan Rice.
Alfred Maine is next up, Republican line. There's Dylan. Hi, Dylan. Go ahead.
Hi, I've got a comment for the Democrats. They need to clean it up and get their act together here. We're looking for some real clean answers that shouldn't be that difficult. The truth is, the truth has been told once. It needs to be black and white with the Democrat folks on the side, and there needs to be no room for error here. We're a strong country. Benghazi was a horrible attack, and we're ready to move forward, period.
Next up, we go to the independent line. Joe in Orlando, Florida. Joe, you've been watching. What have you seen or heard so far in the hearing?
I've watched it all. I'm surprised it didn't take a lunch break, but I watched. I find it scandalous that not one Democrat has asked one question about anything that happened. It doesn't seem like they're interested at all. Being an independent, I watched Ambassador Rice. It doesn't pass the smell test. Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and Rice all talked about this video, and they knew it wasn't true. There's no way anyone can think that thought that story was true. And it's scandalous that nobody on the Democratic side seems to be interested in that.
Of course, hearings were held in the 112th Congress Oversight Committee of the House. This is their first hearing on the issue in the 113th Congress. Again, hearing from three witnesses today, three State Department witnesses. They're in a break here. We continue with your phone call. Sterling, Virginia. Paul's next, Republican line. Go ahead. Hi, Paul.
Hi, I just kind of wanted to comment on the Democrats' very lockstep sort of agenda here, trying to blame everything on the funding, even though all the witnesses have very coherently and very explicitly stated that the major issue has been the decisions made by people higher up in the organization, the Secretary or Assistant Secretary of State. And I just don't see any room for blaming it on the funding that was decided by the House of Representatives earlier in the year.
Let's see what folks on Twitter are saying as we wait for the committee to gavel back in. Again, the hashtag we're using is Benghazi. Here's one from TV Capitalism, who writes, if the media was wondering why the majority of Americans have lost faith in them, they should look at their own Benghazi coverage. Another one here from Richard, Jersey City. Darrell Issa, instead of spending my tax dollars on Benghazi, what about no weapons of mass destruction? And here's one from Liliana, who retweets. She says, also Watergate, this tweet that says, I remember as a kid, Iran-Contra on every channel. Today, Benghazi cover-up, not a peep on ABC, NBC, or CBS. Joel's in Woodland Hills, California. He's on our Democrats line. Joel, go ahead.
Yes, I just find this, as a Democrat, I find this to be just ridiculous and embarrassing for me as a Democrat to hear these Democrats, look at the truth and not back the truth. And I just think that this whole group, from Obama to Hillary Clinton, should be held responsible for what they did. And it's quite obvious what they did. Not only the cover-up, but they didn't protect those people.
On the center of your screen, there is Representative Michelle Bachmann of Minnesota. She's not a member of the committee. She has been sitting in the hearing since the start. Also, you may have been watching earlier, you may have seen former Congressman Pete Hoekstra from Michigan, who was once the ranking Republican on the Select Intelligence Committee. He sat through a good bit of the hearing today. They're in a break, back in a few minutes. Live coverage continuing here on C-SPAN Radio, and we welcome our C-SPAN Radio listeners to the conversation, which, by the way, if you're traveling around, it's on XM Satellite Radio, Channel 119. East Lake, Ohio. Jackie, welcome to our conversation. Go ahead.
Hi. I like the way it's scripted by the Republicans. They apparently got together with the three people ahead of time, and they were very well versed on the subject. The questions were so nicely answered and so well scripted. I must give the Republicans their due. They did a job. They're doing their best to bring down a president and to make sure that Mrs. Clinton has something bad on her record for 2016. Thank you.
Some of the testimony of Gregory Hicks was released early by the committee earlier this week, and maybe some of what you're referring to as well. In Springdale, Arkansas, is Patty. She's on our Republican line. Go ahead, Patty.
Yeah, hi.
Hi there.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I'm a disabled veteran. I'm the longest-running continuous disability claim in the United States of America, 20 years. I'm into my 20th year. But anyway, put that aside. I cannot believe this. These gentlemen are telling the truth, and then the Democrats, I don't think they have an honest, straight question. They keep going to, the budget, the money and everything. Well, that's partially probably true, but that doesn't account for what happened to them on September 11th. No one's bringing up the fact September 11th, 9/11. It just amazes me. But I tell you what, if I was a Democrat, I wouldn't be anymore.
Patty, thanks for the call. Here's what some of the lots of comments on Facebook, some of them here. This is from Kilo Sierra, who writes, there never was an attempt to get military overflights permission that day in Libya. That's a question. Meanwhile, some of the Dems in this hearing are spending their time injecting Media Matters talking points and diversions. Tracy says, I am watching. What proof? Where? John Barry says, we are the most powerful nation on earth, plus we had just helped militarily in taking down the previous government, even had a couple of our planes shoot down. We didn't get permission just to do it. Besides, what are the Libyans going to do? Come over and invade us? And finally, Elizabeth Jane Shackelford saying they're just blowing wind in the wind. It's a witch hunt. Tom's in Westminster, Maryland, calling on the Independence line. Tom, go ahead.
Hi. Comment is very quick. I just wanted to say I think it's very much a shame that we'll probably never get to the bottom of this due to the fact that it's so transparently clear that the parties are sticking to party loyalty.
Well, take the testimony today. Does the testimony today get us any closer to that clarity you're talking about?
Well, I think the Republicans are doing a better job at ferreting out facts. It seems the Democrats are doing a better job at party protection.
Tom, thanks for the call. Here in Washington, Mike's on our Democrats line.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. Two real quick comments. There's some at some point they made Susan Rice's talk show appearance the official statement. Never was. Obama said the day after this was an act of terror. So right there we're looking at a situation where they're trying to basically frame a specific narrative specifically with, exactly at what point did they call this an act of terror? Was it a terrorist incident? Was it the protest, et cetera? Second thing, the Republicans are doing their best to try and nail the State Department and or the National Security Team, but not point fingers at the generals who made the security decisions in the first place. This testimony is pretty much pointing out that at some point there were military individuals who made military decisions about the kind of protection that he should have had, that Ambassador Stevens should have had, and no one's willing to really kind of go any further and say, well, wait a minute, should we be looking at exactly whether or not we should be pointing fingers at military officials? No, let's keep it up with the state officials and with the Obama administration officials.
Mike, thanks for your call. Some of the video you're watching just there, the video from earlier of Chairman Issa, and just to let you know, they're gathering back in the room. We'll be going back there live shortly here on C-SPAN. And a quick reminder about our programming coming up this evening and on Sunday. If you missed any of today, we will have the highlights for you tonight, 9 o'clock Eastern. That'll be here on C-SPAN. Same on Sunday, except it'll be 10:30 a.m. Eastern, the highlights from today's testimony. Let's go to Steve, who's in Montrose, Alabama, Republican.
Yes, sir. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
In a situation where 4 people have been murdered, it's even odd that we have a Democrat.
Steve, I'm going to have to cut you loose there. Sorry. Thanks for waiting. The hearing has gabbled back in. Thanks for all your calls.
Please, and for the attorneys, let me assure you the end is in sight. With that, we go to the gentlelady from Wyoming, Mrs. Loomis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to thank you, gentlemen, for this long day, and for the families. I offer my most sincere condolences from my constituents. They think about you all the time. First question, Mr. Nordstrom. Now, do I understand you had responsibility for security in Libya while you were there?
That's correct.
And then you left in July, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, before you left, did you make security recommendations to Washington, D.C.?
No, we do a turnover report, but that's not really a place where we put recommendations. It's more laying out the situation, the crime, the political situation, and a lot of that reporting I had done previously with Washington.
And so they had recommendations from you or not?
It's my understanding, yes. They had wanted a transition plan specifically on how we were going to transition from the SST and the DS agents to our local bodyguards. That was submitted to them February 15th.
And do you know, were those... was that implementation plan accepted? Was it implemented?
I never really got any feedback from Washington. That was one of the things that surprised me even when I left post. I was never contacted by DS leadership or management from the date I left on the 26th to this date. The only time I had any interaction was preparing before the October hearings, but they've never contacted me to ask me on thoughts about Libya, suggestions, anything like that.
Mr. Hicks, do you know whether security recommendations were implemented? Were there security recommendations that were implemented?
John Martinek, the RRSO, came on board, and he was following up on many of the things that Eric was working on before to strengthen our security posture in Libya. After the attacks, John and I worked on a list of physical security improvements that had to be made in Tripoli in order for us to remain there. And I cabled that list into the department after Congressman Chaffetz's visit. And I learned later that that cable was not well received by Washington leadership. To the ARB's credit, when they saw that cable, they sent it to Undersecretary Kennedy and insisted that every recommendation in that cable be implemented.
Thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit. Mr. Hicks, are you aware of any efforts by department officials to limit department witnesses' access to information about the attack prior to their testimony before Congress?
I have never seen the classified ARB report. So the answer is, in my respect, yes.
Mr. Nordstrom, do you know whether the State Department consciously sought to limit your awareness of certain information prior to your testimony before this committee?
I'm not aware of that.
Let me ask you this. Mr. Nordstrom, I want to read you an excerpt from an email Ambassador Stevens sent to you and a colleague on July 5th, 2012. The email concerned a draft cable intended to request an extension of security personnel for the embassy, which was ultimately sent on July 9th. Now, the ambassador wrote, "Gentlemen, I have taken a close look at the cable and edited it down and rearranged some paragraphs. My intention was to give more focus to what we are doing to end our reliance on TDY support and to let the department figure out how to staff our needs. If it looks okay, please run it by DS and see if they want it front channel." Then, Mr. Nordstrom, can you briefly explain what Ambassador Stevens meant when he asked you to run it by DS and see if they wanted it front channel?
What he's referring to is the process by which we would send an official State Department cable. I had done that for prior requests, and it was my advice to the ambassador, I do remember that dialogue, that we do in fact send that front channel. Within the Department of State, that is considered to be the official record. If I sent something by email or informally discussed it by telephone, it's still valuable, but unless it's on that cable, it's not official. My experience in the past was that as soon as we put those recommendations, just as Greg just alluded to, as soon as we put that onto an official cable, somehow we were seen as embarrassing the Department of State because we are requiring them to live up to their end of the bargain.
I thank the gentlelady. We now go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll add my thanks to the gentleman on the panel. I know you've heard that over and over and over again from members here, but only because folks believe it. And we're grateful to you not just for being here today, but for your decade upon decade of service. I'll tell you, Mr. Thompson, I'm comforted, and I know folks at U.S. posts across the world are comforted that there are men and women who do what you do, who live by a code that says if you're in harm's way, we're going to come for you. Just hang on. And I thank you very much for that commitment.
Thank you.
Mr. Nordstrom, my questions are followed up on my colleague from Wyoming, thinking back to early July 2012. Do you recall your back and forth with Charlene Lamb particularly?
Vividly.
What did you think of that decision-making process? Were those decisions that Ms. Lamb was making, or were those decisions being kicked up to a higher level?
It was unclear. I think largely Das Lamb. But one thing that struck me throughout the entire time that I was in Libya was a strange decision-making process. Specifically, again, the Undersecretary for Management in many ways was dealing directly with Das Lamb. As her supervisor 2 levels ahead, obviously he has that ability to do that. He's well within his right. But it was strange that was that direct relationship, and I never really saw interaction from Assistant Secretary of DS Eric Boswell or our director, Scott Boltrowitz. It was even more clear in October when we were all sitting up here. There was 2 levels, if you will, that were not reflected, and it was quite a jump between Das Lamb and Undersecretary Kennedy. So certainly I felt that anything that Das Lamb was deciding certainly had been run by Undersecretary Kennedy.
And given the seriousness of that conversation, thinking about extending SST and MSD as security support, did you receive an explanation for why that request was denied that satisfied you?
I didn't. As I testified before, what I perceived that it was some sort of explained to me that it would be somehow embarrassing or politically difficult for State Department to